Am I good to go, Dan? Good morning and welcome to everyone who is participating this morning. We are so glad that you've taken some time out of your morning to learn more about freedom of religion. I want to express appreciation to all of you for taking your time to do so, and especially to our panelists and keynote speaker today. They will be introduced a little bit later. My name is David Wright. I serve as an Area 70 here in the state of Oregon for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we are so grateful for Dan Hinman and Ann Metzger, who have been particularly helpful in preparing everything for this event today, and then each panelist that will be introduced later. We will go ahead and begin with an opening prayer. That opening prayer will be offered by Juwaria Saeed from the Muslim Education Trust. Juwaria, please offer the opening prayer.
Good morning. Peace be and blessings to you. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا. Praise be to the Lord of the universe, who has created us and made us into tribes and nations, that we may know each other, not that we may despise each other. If the enemy inclines towards peace, do thou also incline towards peace, and trust in God. For the Lord is the one that hears and knows all things. And the servants of God, most gracious, are those who walk on earth in humility. And when we address them, we say peace. Allahumma anta salamu wa minka salamu, tabarakta ya dhul jalal wal ikram. O Lord, you are the source of peace, and peace comes from you alone. You are blessed, O Lord of majesty and honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juwaria, for that beautiful opening prayer. The keynote speaker for today is Stephen T. Collis. He is a law professor at the University of Texas School of Law, and also an expert on freedom of religion here in the United States of America. I'll turn the time over to him in just a moment, but I wanted to remind you, if you have questions that you would like to ask either Stephen or members of the panel that will be speaking later, please submit those questions in the question and answer function of Zoom. We'll take the last 20 or 25 minutes of this meeting to try to get to some of those questions if you have them. With no further ado, we'll move forward, and Steve, the time is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Elder Wright. Thank you for all the people who's put so much time and energy into planning this. I know how much work it's been. I'm thankful to be here with all of these other esteemed panelists and looking so much to hear what they have to say. As Elder Wright said, my background is in religious freedom law. I am the founding faculty director of the Beck-Lachlan First Amendment Center at the University of Texas, as well as our Religious Freedom Clinic at the University of Texas, where we represent religious groups of all backgrounds and faiths in a wide variety of matters when their religious freedom is challenged. I'll give a few examples of that a little bit later. And prior to my time at Texas, I was the Olin Darling Research Fellow at Stanford University. I appreciate the chance to be here. With all that background stuff's not the important part. The important part that you need to know about me is something that happened from my childhood. It relates directly to religious freedom in a way that won't make sense at first, but I'll explain. When I was 9 years old, I was going off to a summer camp, and I had to, back then, for me, it was really cool to have spiked up hair. So I went in the bathroom and I got the mousse and I spiked my hair up and made myself look really good. I was looking really nice. And I walked out of the bathroom. We didn't have a big home. Pretty much everyone in the family shared the same bathroom. And as I walked out, my mom came by and she stopped me and she started sniffing the air. And she said, "What does that smell?" And I very proudly said, "It's the mousse." And I pointed to my spiked hair. And her eyes got really big and she spun me around, pushed me back into the bathroom, ran my head in the sink and started washing my hair out. And I, of course, had no clue what was going on. It turns out that what I thought was mousse was actually the hair removal product Nair. And within days, all of my hair started falling out. I share that partly as an icebreaker, but partly to tell you, in life, we tend to get in trouble when we're dealing with something and we don't know what it is. And that is often the case when we talk about religious freedom. The term gets used a lot. Most people don't understand it. They often mischaracterize it. People from all political stripes and backgrounds tend to do this. And today what I'm hoping is we can shed a little light on the topic. To break protocol a little bit, one thing I would love to do is I've got, the better part of an hour here to talk to you, and it can be really long, painful, and boring if you're just going to listen to me drone on for an hour. So I'm going to have strategic places where I'm going to stop in case anyone out there, participants, want to ask questions, and you can put those in the Q&A, and I'll turn to the Q&A. So I'll make clear breaking points where I'm just going to stop and say, does anybody have any questions for me right now, so that we can all make sure we're on the same page before I, make a shift, conceptually to a different topic. And I'm happy then to, pour through the Q&A and take a question or two and then continue to move on. There will still be more than enough questions, I'm certain, for our panelists and for all of us on the back end of this. But I think that'll be a nice way to break up our time together, but also make sure that if people want to ask clarifying questions, they can do so. One thing I will say is there's no question you can ask me that's going to offend me or that I haven't heard before. If something is troubling you, if you're not sure about something, if I've said something that's unclear, if you'd like to push back on something I've said, just put it in the Q&A, and I am happy to address it, and we'll do so with gusto. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen and share some slides to help kind of give us a foundational just background of the fundamentals of religious freedom. I want people to understand what I mean when I use that term and what many scholars mean and judges and lawmakers mean. Not all judges and lawmakers, but many. The first thing you have to think about when you think about religious freedom is, or a good exercise to think about is, what would you do if you were drafting the laws for a new country? Very few people have ever had that opportunity in the history of the world. But the founders of the United States, when they first came together and they had won the Revolutionary War, they then had to sit down and figure out what the laws were going to be for this new country that they were trying to form. And one of the concerns that they had was they were coming off of centuries of religious warfare. They were coming off of centuries of religious warfare in their own tradition, in Europe and other places, but they had seen and were aware of religious warfare throughout the world. And so as they're forming laws for this new country, one of the things they were trying to figure out was, how can we craft some type of protections as we form a new government that will prevent that same type of warfare occurring here in this country? There's a couple important things to remember about this. First off, it wasn't religion that was the problem. A lot of people today take the tone that religion is what caused all the warfare. So if we get rid of religion, we'll get rid of the religious warfare. And you can see that reflected here in this little cartoon where you've got wars armed around religion saying, "Oh, where would I be without you?" A lot of people take that view. The problem, of course, is that that wasn't the problem. The problem was more complex than that. The problem was that all people have religious beliefs. The problem comes in really two steps. The first is that all people have religious beliefs. And a lot of people bristle when I say that. Very devout religious believers bristle when I say that. And people who like to think of themselves as not having any religion bristle when I say that. But the reality is there are certain questions to which we all have answers. If I ask you, is there a God? Or what is the purpose of life? Why are we here? What happens to us when we die? The answers to those questions are religious answers. And it's not those answers that lead to bloodshed and warfare and that have historically. It's something else. And the something else is something that we scholars in the field refer to as the Puritan mistake. I'll explain in a little while that it's a bit of a flaw to pick on the poor Puritans, but the Puritan mistake refers to this idea that we have often referred, if you think about, in the United States at least, when we talk about the Puritans, we say that they came to these shores for religious freedom. And it's true, they did. But the reality is they were interested in religious freedom only for themselves. They weren't interested in religious freedom for others. As soon as they really consolidated power in Massachusetts, their view of the world was that you can either abide by our views, our religious views, or you can move out of Massachusetts. That was the Puritan mistake, wanting freedoms for themselves, but not being willing to share those freedoms with others. So what led to all of this warfare in European history, even in the colonies in the United States before it became the United States, in other parts of the world, was this two-step process of all people having religious beliefs and almost all people committing the Puritan mistake. This is why I say it's not really fair to pick on the poor Puritans. What we've seen throughout world history is that human beings tend to commit the Puritan mistake again and again and again, no matter their cultural background, no matter where they're from, no matter their religion. We have seen theists do it to atheists. We have seen atheists do it to theists. We've seen Christians do it to Muslims and Muslims to Christians, Christians to Jews and Jews to Christians. We've seen secular humanists do it to devout believers and vice versa. It goes on and on and on. So the founders had to figure out a way to solve this problem. And what they came up with were two related types of doctrines. We see these reflected in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, and we refer to these as the first freedoms. Now, we often refer to them as the first freedoms, not because they're more important than any of the other freedoms we enjoy, but because they are literally the first two clauses of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. What the founders came up with were these two clauses. The first says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. An establishment of religion is a state church. So essentially what we get from that is we know that there cannot be a state church. We know that government cannot favor or disfavor any one religion over another. Aside from that, it can get complicated, but we know that we have that basic understanding. And then the other clause is Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. That law, of course, limits how much government can actually burden people's exercise of their religion. It's those two clauses working together that create religious freedom. So I've created this little temple of religious freedom here. The free exercise clause, as I said, limits how much government can burden religious exercise. The establishment clause limits how much government can favor one religion or one religious belief. Those two things working together create an environment where religious freedom truly thrives. Now, all of that is subject, or should be subject, in a world where you have true religious freedom, both of those principles would be playing a very important role, but they would both be subject to something we in the law refer to as the compelling interest test. What that means is that religious freedom is not absolute. Government may have compelling interests that might require it to sometimes burden people's religious exercise. Just to give you an example, if I have a religious belief that says, once a year, I need to sacrifice a 12-year-old boy to the gods, I think we would all agree that government has a compelling interest in stopping me from doing that. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, there's actually a religion where we could sacrifice 12-year-old boys to the gods. Because if you've ever raised a 12-year-old boy, that doesn't sound as insane as probably most people think it is. But the reality is we would all agree that there's a compelling interest there in stopping that type of sacrifice, right? So, but that's just the first part of the compelling interest test. The second part of the test is that government has to pick the most narrow means possible for achieving its interest. So if I have this belief where I want to sacrifice a 12-year-old boy to the gods once a year, the government could come in and say, blow up my church, or confiscate all my property, or arrest all members of my church, or slap fines on us that are so expensive that our entire church could never operate again. It could do all that, but that's not the most narrow way of achieving its goal. Probably its most narrow way of achieving its goal is taking steps to ensure that I don't act on my religious belief. And if they, if they have to arrest me or something, fine, but they might be able to take other steps. The point is that the government can't go overbroad when it's trying to burden people's religious exercise. It needs to take the most narrow approach possible if it indeed does have a compelling interest. And generally in the law, we refer to compelling interest as interests of the highest order. These are interests that deal with life and property and safety, that kind of a thing. That's the basics of religious freedom. In that environment, where what I have just described is actually operating, what we end up with is a world where all of us are on an equal playing field. When we talk about trying to convert one another, to proselytize to one another, to change each other's minds regarding religion, we're doing it in an environment where government is playing as little role as possible. Because what that means is, instead of spending all of our time and energy as separate religious groups trying to fight for the power of government. Instead, what we spend our time doing is working on proselytizing to one another. What we realize is that the way we're going to bring people into our camp is not going to be through government coercion or power or through government oppression. It's going to be through the power of our doctrines, the spirit that people feel when they visit with us, the clarity of our thinking, the charitable works that we do, the power of our example to others when they see us. That's what's going to bring people in to our camp. And that's what we should be focusing on, not controlling government and using government to change people's minds. Humanity has tried that for centuries. In many countries, it is still trying it. And by and large, it almost always results in warfare and bloodshed, something I will talk about a little bit later. So those are that there, and I should emphasize, this protects everyone. I'll share some stories in a little while, but it protects atheists, it protects agnostics, it protects the most devout Christians and Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Sikhs. I could go on and on and on. It protects everyone in our country. And it allows all of us to feel like we can focus on our own spiritual and religious development without having the power of the government or the power of the majority who have power being forced upon us. So I'd like to stop right there if I could. And just let me check and see if there are questions coming from the Q&A. If you've had questions that popped into your mind and you didn't type them into the Q&A, please type them in now. We'll pause for a minute. I want to make sure we're all on the same page and that we all understand each other before I move on to talk about some other aspects of this. So someone says, why did I neglect to mention the liberty of conscience clause that was removed by the Senate? So it's probably just for lack of time, quite frankly. So there was a debate in the federal Congress. First of all, we should emphasize that during the early time of the founding, most people don't know this, but the Constitution only applied to the federal government. It was meant to limit the federal government. After the Civil War, all of these clauses protecting religious freedom have now been applied to state, local, county governments and lower, right? But originally it was just for the federal government. And there was a proposal to say, hey, why don't we protect freedom of conscience, not just freedom of religion, not just the exercise of religion, but why don't we protect freedom of conscience? And that got voted out and didn't get included in it. So you can at least, if you're an originalist, and if you want to lock yourself into religious or to the original meaning of the Constitution, the question is, what does religion mean, right? We have to define that. We have to figure that out. Many people would argue that based on the fact that they took freedom of conscience out, we at least know that religion means more than simply people's personal conscience or personal philosophies. It's got to be something more than that. Although defining religion is not the easiest thing in the world. So good question. So someone else says, what does separation of church and state actually mean, and where does that idea originate? By the way, I will apologize now. I won't be able to get to all of these questions. I'm trying to get to a couple and then we'll have to move on. But so this question, what does separation of church and state actually mean, and where does that idea originate? So the idea originates from, it's not in the Constitution. It's really not found in any laws anywhere. The idea and the term originally came from something that Thomas Jefferson said. He talked about wanting to have a wall between church and state. So for many people, what that means, I think that on its most basic meaning, separation of church and state means there shouldn't be a state church. Other countries have tried that. Some countries still have them. It usually doesn't work very well. That's the most simplest meaning, is that there should be no state church. Beyond that, scholars disagree, and people disagree about what separation of church and state means. Personally, I think it means what I just described. It's an environment where government is not favoring any one religion or religious belief over another. And it's an environment where government is not burdening people's religious exercise unless it has a compelling interest to do so and is taking the most narrow means possible to achieve that interest. We keep government and religion as separated as much as possible. One scholar has described it as government should play as little role as possible in either encouraging or discouraging religion. It should just stay out of it. All right, let me look at So someone asked, are there specific trends you notice that are particularly threatening to religious freedom? I'm going to come to that later, so I'll pass on that one. And someone asks, is this why the culture wars are so bad? Because they're culture wars, or they're trying to get government to codify my beliefs, creates the war we now experience. This is a very interesting question. This is partly why the culture wars are so bad, because what you have is a massive religious divide in the culture wars. And we can maybe get into this more on the panel, but you have a massive religious divide in the culture wars, and you have both the far, far right and the far, far left trying to force their beliefs on each other without trying to find a way to live in an environment where they're not doing that. And that has resulted in exacerbated ongoing culture war battles regarding religious freedom and other cultural issues. I want to emphasize something though. When we talk about culture wars, we're usually talking about things related to LGBT plus rights or abortion rights. That gets almost all of the media attention. When we talk about religious freedom in the United States, those conflicts actually make up less than 2% of the live cases dealing with religious freedom in the United States. They get about 99% of the media attention. They make up the tiniest little sliver of the actual instances where religious freedom is playing a very important role in our society. So it's important not to think that that's the only time religious freedom is doing anything. It's just that that's the only time the media reports on it. And I'll give you some live examples a little bit later to emphasize this, to show you just how broadly and how deeply religious freedom is protecting so many different people in our country. Great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to more, but please keep them coming, and I will address them as I can when we have our next breaking point. And certainly other panelists can chime in as well when we get to the panel part of it. So here we are. We have this kind of basic understanding of religious freedom and how it should be working and what it should be doing for us. Now what I want to do is I'm going to focus on this side of the religious freedom temple that I have here. So both clauses are crucial. The free exercise clause and the establishment clause are crucial for religious freedom, but we're going through about 2 years worth of material here in less than an hour, so I have to pick and choose what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to emphasize here is the free exercise clause, because that tends to be what comes up the most. When people in our country are worried about religious freedom and what it means, and when they see it being burdened or potentially threatened, it usually has to do with the free exercise of religion being threatened. So I want to give you some understanding of what that means and how it works. Thomas Jefferson had a letter that he wrote, and in it he laid out kind of some views of religious freedom that still apply today. What he talked about was, as you move down this continuum here, from conduct to worship to speech to membership in a church or religion down to belief, as you go down that continuum, the government's authority or the government's right to regulate should decrease, so that when we get down to belief, government really shouldn't be involved at all. And you can kind of see how this would work, right? When we talk about conduct, again, to use my absurd example, if I have a religious belief and a practice that I think it's important to sacrifice 12-year-old boys to the gods, I think everyone would agree the government's at its greatest authority to stop me in that conduct. But as I move away from wanting to engage in the conduct, if it's just something that we talk about in worship services, or it's just something that we talk about as a religious group, or I just happen to be a member of an organization that has this teaching. And finally, if I just have the belief, but I would never act on it, the government's authority should decrease. Most people agree with this continuum. The question really is about exercise of religion and specifically conduct. Here's how this often plays out. It comes in the form of what we call religious exemptions, and it always follows the same pattern, okay? What ends up happening is the majority in power passes some kind of law or regulation. They're trying to get at some government interest. That may or may not be a compelling interest, but they're trying to get at some government interest. The law doesn't burden the religion of most people. If it did, the majority in power never would have passed it in the first place. But the law does burden the religion of some, okay? That group then asks for an exemption to the law. That group says, hey, look, you've passed this law. It's now burdening our religious exercise. We need protection from it. And so they seek that protection through the laws protecting religious freedom, either the free exercise clause or some various statutes that are out there. Finally, those who are opposed to the exemption almost always claim that society will collapse if the exemption is granted. In other words, what they'll say is, if we grant you, and I'm not using that as hyperbole, it's really true. What they say is, if we grant you this exemption, we're going to have to grant exemptions to everybody, or all these other people are going to come and claim that they should get the exemptions. And other people are going to pretend that they're a part of religious groups just to get these exemptions. Okay, this pattern has played out since the beginning of the founding of the United States. And I'll just give you an example. At the time of the founding, the Quakers, let me back up. You have a new country. You've got 13 new states trying to figure out how they're going to protect themselves. They perceive themselves as weak. There's potential enemies everywhere. They're trying to figure out how to survive. And most of the states pass a law saying that every able-bodied young man needs to join the militia. And these militias together are going to create an army that can then protect this new country that has formed. And there were no exemptions to that, except that in many states, and especially Pennsylvania, the Quakers were pacifists. And they requested an exemption to the law, saying, please, you can't, this may not burden any of the Protestants or Catholics who are here. It was mostly a Protestant country, mostly Protestants, of the religious people in the country, it was mostly Protestants. The Quakers said, we are pacifists, we can't bear arms. Please don't force us to do this. So they're asking for that exemption. This argument was made. People said, look, if we give the Quakers an exemption, then all these people, who wants to fight in a war? Nobody's going to want to join the militia. Everybody's going to claim they need an exemption, and we're going to have a major problem on our hands. All of this got debated and talked about and argued over, and eventually most states gave the Quakers the exemption they needed. And what ended up happening is they were able to form the militias that they needed to protect the country. The Quakers were able to contribute to the founding of the United States in their own unique way without sending their children to war. And they were able to get the exemption that they needed in order to stay in the country. Otherwise, the Quakers really had no choice. What they would have ended up doing is spending their days in prison, sitting out the war and sitting out really the founding of the United States rather than being able to contribute to it. So let me show you some other examples of the way this same pattern has played out over time. This man in this picture is Roy Torcaso. In 1959, he lived in Maryland, not too far outside of DC. And he was a devout family man. He was a devoted husband and father. He was a veteran of World War II and of the Korean War. He had fought in both. He went to get a job as a notary public, which should have been nothing more than a rubber stamp, with the state of Maryland. He walked up the courthouse steps, passed in. All he had to do was go in and sign some documents with the court clerk, and then he would have been a notary public, which would have allowed him to excel more at his job where he worked. When he got to the clerk's desk, they handed him a piece of paper that required him, and it required this of everybody. So here's this law that applies to everybody. It required everybody who wanted to get a job with the state of Maryland to sign a document saying that they believed in a supreme being. Roy Torcaso was many things, but he was also an atheist at the time. And he had spent years praying. He had spent years reading scripture. He had spent years pondering whether or not there was a God. And at that time in his life, he could not say in good conscience and in truth to himself that there was a supreme being. So he put the pen down and he told the clerk, I can't sign this document. The clerk kind of got angry with him. They had a kind of a bit of yelling match, and Roy stormed out of the courthouse and went home, and he was furious. And he walked into his kitchen. His little boy was playing off to the side. His wife was cooking dinner. They had no air conditioning. It was middle of summer. It was brutally hot. And she kind of asked him how his day went. And the first thing out of his mouth was, I'm going to sue. And of course, she was like, what? He sued. And he essentially said, you have this rule, but you can't force it upon me in good faith. He lost in the trial court. He lost in Maryland's highest state court by unanimous vote. And at that point, Maryland's highest court declared that he was not worthy to be a witness in a trial or to have any job with the state on account of his religious beliefs as an atheist. And so he appealed up to the United States Supreme Court. And there he won his case 9-0. And what the Supreme Court said was, you cannot punish people for their beliefs or disbeliefs regarding religion. And you can't have laws simply because they apply to everyone else and don't burden other people that then burden people simply because of their religious beliefs. And Roy was able to get his job as a notary public, and his very first act was to notarize a document that his daughter needed signed so she could be a ham radio operator. And this is a picture of him there with his daughter. Incidentally, she went on to become a judge and graduated from one of the country's most elite law schools. Here's another example. This one is right out of Oregon, and so it should be fitting for all of you. It's actually the landmark case probably in United States history regarding the free exercise of religion. This is Al Smith. Al was a Klamath Indian man. He grew up on the Klamath tribal lands near Klamath Lake in Oregon. His case is really complicated, but when it finally reached the Supreme Court for the second time, there was one simple question before the Supreme Court. Can the state of Oregon criminalize the use of peyote in Native American religious exercises, in Native American religious ceremonies? That was the question. Let me go back to that pattern I told you that religious exemptions always follow. The pattern is relatively simple here. Oregon passed a law saying the use of peyote is criminalized across the board. Most people in Oregon didn't care about that. They probably didn't even know about it, right? Especially because peyote really has no recreational market. It causes nausea and sickness. It tastes bitter. It's not a pleasant experience. Very few people at all ever use this as a recreational drug. So most people didn't care about it. But there was one group who did. Devout followers of the Native American Church use peyote as their central sacrament in very critical religious exercise and ceremonies that they do. They were very worried about this. And so Al Smith brought suit and the case went up to the Supreme Court. And again, the same argument was made. If you allow it for them, the floodgates are going to open and pretty soon we're going to have legalized drugs everywhere because people are going to be claiming religious exemptions. Let me tell you a little bit about Al Smith. Al, as a small boy on the Klamath Indian lands, when he was 7 years old, was taken from his home by federal government agents and forced into a number of private religious schools, first a Catholic school, then a Methodist school. These were schools that were funded by the government. And so you had government agents taking these small children from the Klamath tribe and forcing them into these schools and forcing them to live in housing at the schools away from their families. Al continued to run and try to get back home. He would run away from these schools and he would hop on trains from Portland down to the Klamath tribal lands to get back to his family. He was forbidden from speaking his Klamath language. His parents and grandparents and others were forbidden by government agents from practicing their own religion. You can see massive violations of both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause here, if you think about it. Eventually, to keep Al from continuing to try to run back to his tribal lands, they moved him to a government-run school in Nevada. And over time, he forgot his Klamath Indian language. He forgot any semblance of his Klamath religion. And slowly just kind of became more of a typical teenager. But he also started suffering from a lot of depression and anxiety and other problems. He started drinking alcohol to deal with that. And by the time he was in his early 20s, he was an alcoholic. By the time he reached age 37, he woke up one morning in an alley in Sacramento under some cardboard boxes. And he realized that if he didn't stop drinking, he was going to die. So here he was, 37 years old. He went to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. And when he got into the meeting, they told him, one of the things you have to do in order to overcome alcoholism is rely on some form of higher power, some divine being. And he almost got up and walked out because when he thought of a divine being, all he could think of was being taken from his family and forced into these schools where people of other religions were trying to force him to accept their practices and beliefs. But then he had this memory of his mom, or of his grandmother, I'm sorry, when he was a little boy walking around their home near Klamath Lake and praying to some god in the Klamath tongue. and she would walk around the house with incense and she would say these prayers. And he remembered that, and he thought to himself, if my grandmother could pray to some form of God, then I can too. And he started to pray, and from that day forward, for the next 50 years, for the rest of his life, he never touched another drop of alcohol and never relapsed. And he became actually a major and important player in helping overcome addiction among Native Americans. So part of his religious practices that helped him continue to remain sober were getting involved in the Native American church, and in particular, this practice of ingesting peyote once or twice only as part of this religious exercise and this religious ceremony. And the state of Oregon had criminalized it. So when it got up to the Supreme Court had to answer the question, should the Native American church get an exemption to this law that otherwise criminalizes peyote? And what the Supreme Court said was no. In an opinion by Justice Antonin Scalia, what they said was, look, the way we interpret the free exercise clause, if a law applies to everybody, then it doesn't really matter if it happens to burden people's religious exercise. This, of course, was devastating to the Native American church. Congress ended up immediately passing laws and statutes to protect the Native American church so that they could still go forward with their religious exercise. But the case Oregon versus Smith was kind of like a bomb going off in the religious freedom community, and it reverberates to this day, because to this day, there's a sense that religious freedom is not nearly as protected as it should be, because under the Smith case, religion does not necessarily promise these exemptions to laws that otherwise apply to everyone else. You have to think about what this case meant as well. What it meant was, if we were to go back to prohibition today and ban alcohol across the board, it would mean Catholics cannot celebrate Mass and Jews couldn't celebrate Seder without violating the law. So let me pause there again. I want to make sure I don't run out of time, and maybe we can take one more question. I see a lot of questions lingering there. So let me go down. Some of these, is prohibiting drugs a favoring of a religious belief? Somebody asks. No, I don't think so, unless it's done in the name of a particular religion. Usually government's reasons for prohibiting drugs have to do with potential for abuse and all the negative things that come from it. It's not often isn't the case that many drug laws are being pushed by any type of religious group. Now, if you had, let's say you took the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who has something called the Word of Wisdom and a strong religious belief that people should not drink alcohol, if their doctrines were then put into law as their doctrines, that would be a problem. But just because a particular law happens to coincide with some religion's beliefs, that's not a problem. That's not a violation of the Establishment Clause or favoring a religious belief. In other words, if government has independent reasons, they're not just putting something into law because it happens to be pushed upon them by some religious group, that doesn't violate the Establishment Clause. If it did, we probably wouldn't be able to pass any laws, because almost every law coincides with some group's religious beliefs. Let me, in the interest of time, let me keep moving forward here, and we've got all these questions, so we can continue to address them in the panel, and maybe at one more point when I stop here. So how does all this play out in the pandemic? We've seen these orders coming across the country. I'm sure you've seen some religious challenges to the orders. In some instances, when states have ordered that churches cannot gather, there has been the compelling interest test in play. In other words, the state has to prove that it has a compelling interest in stopping the spread of the virus, and it has to prove that it's taken the most narrow means possible for achieving that interest. In those states, then, most people have agreed that the government has a compelling interest in stopping the spread of the virus. The question really comes down to, has the government taken the most narrow approach possible? So in some instances, for example, if the government were refused to allow a church, or let's say limited church attendance to 10 people in a building that can seat 3,000, arguably that is not a narrowly tailored approach to prevent the spread of the virus, right? In a building that could seat 3,000, the government probably could allow up to 50% capacity, and people could still remain properly social distanced with masks on. So the question is, are they taking the most narrow approach to achieve their goal? after the Smith case, when the Smith case changed the law a little bit under the First Amendment, there are some states now where the compelling interest test doesn't apply. And instead, what you have is a question of, is a law neutral and generally applicable? That's really complicated and is probably going to take too long to get into. But essentially what it forces courts to ask is the state allowing exemptions to its laws that undermine its interest in protecting against the virus? And if it is then it is required to also allow exemptions for religious organizations. So for example, if the state of Minnesota, I'll just give one example of this and we'll have to move on. The state of Minnesota at one point issued an order saying that movie theaters and concerts could have 50% capacity, but churches still were going to be limited to very small numbers, like 10 people, even if the church held 2,000. And those churches immediately wrote to the governor and said, wait a minute. A movie theater and a concert undermines your interest in protecting against the virus to the exact same degree meeting together in a church would. You can't do that. And to his credit, the governor of Minnesota immediately changed course and said, you know what, you're right. And then started treating the churches the same way he was movie theaters and concerts. So that's how some of this is playing out during the pandemic. But let me give you a few other examples. I mentioned that I'm the director of our Religious Freedom Clinic at the University of Texas. We represent religious groups all over the United States. All of them deal with these types of questions of should people get exemptions. Here are just some of the cases that we're working on, and we've turned down far, far more. And I'll emphasize, I have yet to receive a phone call asking for our help that has actually touched on the traditional culture war issues. As I mentioned earlier, there just aren't that many of those cases out there. What cases are we seeing? We are helping a sick soldier who's trying to become a chaplain, but the chaplaincy right now won't allow sick soldiers. We are helping a Latter-day Saint prisoner who has been authorized by his ecclesiastical authorities that he can wear certain clothing, but the prison is refusing to allow him to wear it. We're representing a sick prisoner who cannot, because of his religious beliefs, shave his beard or his hair. And yet the prison is requiring him to do so, even though there's ample evidence that there's not a security risk. We're representing a historically Black Baptist church who bought land and saved for 20 years to be able to build a building on their land. And 6 months before they were ready to break ground, the government came in and tried to take their land from them using eminent domain. We're representing a prisoner who's been denied a spiritual advisor in the execution chamber. We're representing churches who are striving their best to help the homeless, to provide housing and food and clothing for the homeless, but are being restricted in their ability to do so by city governments and HOAs. All of us have heard this phrase, not in my backyard, NIMBY. A lot of people say it's a good thing to help the homeless as long as you're not doing it in my neighborhood. And so these churches are being restricted dramatically in their ability to help the homeless. We are representing Muslim groups who have been denied the opportunity to go overseas to receive the religious training that they need to then come back here and take care of their own congregations and groups. Representing churches who are facing extensive tort liability far more than they should. We're representing a Christian who is in a very hostile work environment and is constantly having his beliefs berated. I hope you can see I share these examples. On some part, it's completely selfish. I want you to know what our clinic is doing, and I want you to send things my way if you hear about burdens on people's religious freedom. But my more important goal is to show you the absolute breadth with which religious freedom is protecting people in our country today. The laws that protect religious freedom cut across so many different belief systems. They protect everyone. And you can see it happening right now in our society as these various groups all across the country from so many different backgrounds are all using the same laws to try to protect themselves from governments who are oftentimes just not sensitive to the needs of what is a minority religious group in a particular community. So the question, of course, is why give religious exemptions? I've talked about this idea of the same pattern comes up every time. The same arguments have been made since the founding of the United States about why we should and should not give religious exemptions. There are at least three reasons that people have felt religious exemptions are important. One of the first is to prevent warfare. And let me just share with you something from around the time of the founding. As I mentioned, one of the things that the founders were trying to avoid was a repeat of the warfare and the bloodshed that had occurred previously. And James Madison saw the solution. And so in this one document he wrote related to protecting religious minorities, he wrote this, and I'll read his quote and then I'll kind of unpack it. He said, "Torrents of blood have been spilt in the old world by vain attempts of the secular arm to extinguish religious discord, by proscribing all differences in religious opinions." In other words, torrents of blood have been spent by trying to use the government to suppress people who disagree with the majority in power. And then he says this, Madison goes on, "Time has at length revealed the true remedy. Every relaxation of narrow and rigorous policy, wherever it has been tried, has been found to assuage the disease." In other words, the disease of bloodshed and the problems that come when people try to oppress other people's religious beliefs, that disease goes away when government doesn't force itself upon people. And he says this, "The American theater has exhibited proofs that equal and complete liberty, if it does not wholly eradicate the disease, sufficiently destroys its malignant influence on the health and prosperity of the state." So for Madison, this was just a practical thing. Look, we've had nothing but warfare every time we try to force government on people. Why don't we try something else? And what we've seen here is that we don't need to do that. In another case involving a Catholic priest in 1813 New York, a judge ruled there in favor of a Catholic priest in a case that I don't have time to go into now. But the judge wrote this. He said, "Although no human legislator has a right to meddle with religion, yet the history of the world is a history of oppression and tyranny over the consciences of men. And the sages who formed our Constitution sought to prevent the introduction of calamities that have deluged the world with tears and blood." So at least one reason was to avoid that type of warfare and bloodshed that comes when government oppresses religion. And I want to tell you, in the United States, the peace that we enjoy while being the most religiously diverse country in the history of the world is unique. It's unique in human history, and it's even unique in the world today. You don't have to look very far to see religious warfare being carried out in other countries where they don't have robust protection for religious freedom. The second reason is religion as a public good. That is to say, religion provides much that is good to society. This is being lost on far too many people. But the vast majority of charitable work in the United States is being done through religion. Religion's efforts to try to make bad people good and good people better is an important aspect of our society. And many people have argued that if you don't allow for religious exemptions, what you end up with is a society where religions can't fully flourish, and therefore they cannot provide that public good that they otherwise would be able to. And finally, many of the founders were persuaded by a philosopher named Montesquieu, who argued that in order for a free society to flourish, the people have to have virtue. So if you're going to have a government run for and by the people, those people have to have virtue. And Montesquieu at least argued that that virtue would come from a freedom of religion, a flowering of religion. He didn't pin it necessarily on one religious belief, but the idea was that if religions were allowed to flourish, people would be able to find those places that would help them find meaning in their lives and therefore become better and more virtuous citizens and then contribute to the society that they are supposed to be helping govern. Those are the three primary reasons for religious exemptions. Now, what is the biggest threat to religious liberty today? And this is kind of where I'll wrap up. The share of the population who are leaving organized religion is ballooning at a rate, I won't say it's unprecedented, but it's quite high. And it has happened before, and I'll get to that in a little bit. The group that we call the nuns, and I don't mean this to mean as we might think of like a Catholic nun, but instead when you have surveys that are given and say, the survey questions will ask, what is your religious affiliation? There's a box where people can check that says none, N-O-N-E. The percentage of the population in the United States who belong to the nuns has risen from 16% in 2017 to 26% in 2019. That is a massive increase of people who are saying that they have no affiliation with religion. That's not necessarily saying that they're atheist or agnostic, but it's people who no longer want to be involved with organized religion. And what ends up happening is when people are not religious, they tend to find other things that they value more than other people's religion. So they find, in other words, they eventually get to the point where there is every interest they find from government they consider to be a compelling interest. And so it doesn't matter to them anymore if religion starts to get burdened, because they feel like these interests that they hold dear are always more important than other people's religious interests. This shifting culture is, I would say and argue, the biggest threat to religious freedom. If I go back to these cases that my clinic is working on right now, these are all symptoms. These are all symptoms of different people in different parts of the country who are in power, who value whatever they're trying to do more than the religious beliefs of the people that they are burdening. But the symptoms, we don't want to deal with symptoms. We want to deal with the underlying problem. The underlying problem is so many people not really being involved in religion anymore, and continuing, these numbers continue to rise. It's a dramatic change in the United States. But here's the good news. It's actually happened before. At the time of the founding of the United States, when the founders and some of the various legislatures were debating over the exemption for the Quakers, they were arguing, one person actually made the argument. He said, look, religion is going by the wayside. Fewer and fewer people are religious. And soon, if you grant this to the really religious Quakers, what's going to end up happening is you're going to get all these non-religious people taking advantage of it. And he said, we all know that religion soon is not going to be a part of our life. And the reason he was making this argument is at the time of the founding, there was quite a dramatic movement away from religion. This was the time of the Enlightenment, and people were more interested in reason, and they weren't seeing the need to pursue spirituality and religion. And so we've seen this before. And of course, we know from United States history that what ended up happening was a massive return to religion. People started to ask the questions: what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life? Why am I here? Is there a God? What happens when I die? And they started turning back to religion to answer those questions. So what is the solution here then? The first part of the solution, I would say, if you care about religious freedom, is to get involved locally. The media tends to only report when the federal government is doing something that can burden religious freedom. But if I go back again to those cases that my clinic is working on that are a good example of what's happening across the United States, what you'll notice is that almost every single one of those has absolutely nothing to do with the federal government. Those are all things that state and local governments are doing. And the good news is you can get involved locally. You can be involved in school boards. You can be involved in city council. You can go speak at city council. You can talk to state legislatures, and you can let them know the importance of religious freedom. If you see someone else's religious freedom being burdened, you can speak up. If you see the government pushing someone's religious beliefs or coercing their religious beliefs, you can speak up. You can get involved. But the second thing you can do is, in my view, even more important, because it gets to the underlying root cause, and that is this. All of us, I think, can spend more time pondering and praying about how we can be the light that attracts people back to religion. I think there's a tendency when we see people leaving religion to want to point the finger at them and say, well, what's wrong with them? Instead, I think those who care about religion and their own religious traditions need to be asking themselves, what can I do so that people are attracted to this? When they start asking the hard questions about life and where's the meaning in life, and how can I get guidance, and is there a God, that they will see in us an example that they want to follow. That, I think, is the crucial thing that all of us can do to protect religious freedom in the long term. And I don't mean it to be some amorphous, fluffy thing that you don't take seriously. It is crucial that people start to look at the religions of the world and say, wow, they are bringing so much good to this world. I want some of that. I want the guidance. And I don't think, let me just say, I am not suggesting that the religions of the world need to be changing their teachings or their beliefs or their doctrines to adapt to a changing culture around them. Churches have tried to do that, and their numbers have continued to fall. So I don't have the exact answer for every religious group out there, but what I do know is that all of these religions have key components that have attracted adherents over the years, and we need to make sure we're doing everything we can so that other people will continue to be attracted to them going forward. And then in turn, we'll see the value in them when government tries to burden people's religious practice. I'm so grateful that you've invited me here today. Let me just say, if you've got questions or comments, keep them coming into the chat and we'll try to address them all during the panel discussion. You're also welcome to email me. And I'm happy to address questions if I can, or you can contact me through my website. Ordinarily, when I speak at events like this, people will come up to me and ask me to sign my book for them. My book is called Deep Conviction. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic and doing this over Zoom, I can't sign books, but my publisher has worked very hard to find a solution to that. If you'd like a signed copy of the book and couldn't get one because we're here, shoot me an email and let me know. We can personalize it. And what I'll send you is something called a book plate that I sign for you, personalized. I mail it to you, or my publisher will, and then it actually sticks to the inside of the book on the signature page, and you can have a signed copy of that. Thank you so much for having me. And with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to Elder Wright.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was enlightening and very helpful. We'll go ahead and take a 5-minute break now. And why don't we all plan on being back here at about 10:02, and then we will begin the panel discussion. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. I will now turn the time over to Ann Metzger, who has been very helpful in setting this whole thing up. She is a lawyer in the Portland area and the Pacific Northwest area director for the J. Reuben Clark Law Society. So Ann will take some time to introduce our panelists, and then she will be the moderator. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Elder Wright. It's a pleasure to be here today. I did want to introduce a little bit about our Law Society for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and kind of connect the dots of why our Law Society is involved in this religious freedom event. And I'm honored to have asked to have be here, and to be able to moderate this panel today. The J. Reuben Clark Law Society's mission is to affirm the strength brought to the law by a lawyer's personal religious conviction. And we strive through public service and professional excellence to promote fairness and virtue founded upon the rule of law. So the opportunity to co-sponsor this event is completely aligned with the mission of the Law Society, in that it touches on the intersection between religious convictions and the law. And so we're just so excited to be involved. We are so grateful to have our panel members here with us today, and we are anticipating an informative discussion. I would like to introduce our panel members just briefly here. All of them are very accomplished in their own areas, and so I just had to quickly pull out a few highlights in the interest of time today. Our first panel member is Senior Pastor J.W. Matt Hennessee of the Vancouver Avenue First Baptist Church of Portland. Our second panelist will be Dr. Paul Louis Metzger. He's a professor of Christian theology and theology of culture at Multnomah University and Bible Seminary. Then we have Sheikh Dr. Wajdi Saeed. He is the co-founder and president of the Muslim Education Trust. And we have Bishop Peter Smith, who is the auxiliary bishop for the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Portland. We will also be joined by Elder David L. Wright. He is the Area 70 for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And also Stephen Collis, who we just heard as our keynote speaker, will also be joining us. For those of you who may not have been here for the first portion of our conference, he is a law professor at the University of Texas School of Law and the faculty director of Texas's Beck Laughlin First Amendment Center of Law and Religion Clinic. As we begin our discussion today, I wanted to remind the audience members to go ahead and utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you have as we move forward with our discussion. We'll try to address some of those questions as we proceed through the discussion today. We apologize if we're not able to answer your question live, but hopefully this will spur a continued discussion after this. We have a Facebook group and a website that might be able to answer some of your questions that we don't get to today. I also would like to remind our panel members that in the interest of time, our goal is to touch on as many topics as we can today for the discussion. So please try to keep your answers short and focused within about a 2-minute time frame. I have been informed and inspired by Steve's remarks today, and so it's our hope that as we continue with this discussion, that this will also be an informative session for our audience. And we really would like to focus on the importance of religious freedom in our communities, as well as kind of understand the needs and concerns of the different faith communities. This is a very important shared issue that we all have in common. And so I wanted to thank our distinguished panel members for being with us here today. I wanted to start with a question for each of our faith leaders here on the panel. And I just wanted to ask, and maybe you can respond just in a few sentences, to describe what religious freedom means to you personally, as well as to your individual faith community. And Pastor Hennessee, I thought we could start with you.
Moderator Metzger, to our distinguished speaker, Attorney Collis, to each of these amazing panelists, and to the sponsors, and each of you who are with us today. I'm very thoughtful about this question and very thoughtful about our time together. And from my perspective, the ability during a time that we are in my view, a great awakening, I believe it's important that we embrace this notion of religious freedom from the standpoint of recognizing that each one of us as individuals are blessed with the opportunity to make choices and to be called. My role, my religious connections are about a calling from God, and to know that this is what I am in the world to do. And at the same time, that being in the world means that I'm not, quote, of the world, and therefore that my thoughts, my ways, my ambassadorship, my leadership, my reach to my brothers and sisters, despite their religious background, is the opportunity for me to, on the one hand, have expression that is important and fulfilling in my life, but at the same time to honor, respect, appreciate, and learn from my brothers and sisters whose religious beliefs and expressions may be totally different than mine, and to reach out to each other from a standpoint of understanding, no matter what our beliefs may be, that we are sons and daughters of God, and a belief that we can work together, and that more importantly, He seeks us to find each other and figure out how we can live together peaceably. Now, for a Baptist preacher, Moderator Metzger, that's my short answer.
Thank you, Pastor Hennessee. Bishop Smith, could you share with us your thoughts?
Thank you, and greetings to all those of you who are joining us online on this conference. We all hope that this helps us understand the issue more clearly. Very simply for us as Roman Catholics, what does religious freedom mean to us is that it's a cherished liberty that allows us to practice, believe, and worship our faith, not only inside our church buildings, but also out into the public square, where we live our lives as Catholics, formed by the faith that we have, and that forms how we engage the world, engage those around us. This is a cherished gift that we have, as Steve pointed out earlier on. In the United States, I'm an immigrant to this country. In the United States, we take this for granted, that we have this gift. And for us to flourish like this, we also have to recognize the rights of others who may have different beliefs from us to also be able to flourish. We may have different claims, but we have to recognize that, because in that realm, when we all can flourish, as Steve pointed out, society is better. And so for us, religious freedom is a very, very important thing to allow us to live our lives, but also to allow others to live their lives of faith, and to allow us to engage with one another and the world around us.
Thank you. Dr. Metzger.
Thank you for the honor to be a part of this conversation today. When I think about the subject and what I'm being asked here now, I think about dirty bathwater. We don't want to throw out the baby with the dirty bathwater, and in this case, religious liberty. As was argued by our keynote, there are many reasons why religious liberty is important. When I think about the Latin for religio, it's often understood to be the root bound up with to rebind a broken cosmos. Even in the book of James, this is the kind of religion that God cares for, to care for orphans, widows, and aliens in their distress while keeping oneself from being polluted by the world system. And so there's an importance to religious liberty. We don't want to throw out the baby with the dirty bathwater. And yet, as many people rightly share their concerns, there is dirty bathwater, especially when those who have power, a dominance in a society, exercise that without real consideration for the religious liberties of all, including secularists, pagans, and the like, concerns for their well-being. etc. And I'm an evangelical Protestant, and I think this is a real challenge for my evangelical Protestant tradition to really be concerned for the religious liberties of all. And I think if we're not honoring the religious liberties of others, we shouldn't expect our religious liberties to be cherished and appreciated as well. And so it's an ongoing dialogue to go through our convictions, not around them, and not to stop short of them in our multi-faith society. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Saeed, what's your perspective?
Thank you very much, Anne. Before I answer the question, I would like to remember my beloved members of the LDS Church, Mrs. Clancy, the late Mrs. Clancy, and also Maurice Taylor. And I would like to honor also my beloved sister of the Holy Name, Sister Molly, my beloved brother, Reverend Dr. Hector Lopez, and my brother, Pastor Hennessee, and so many other religious leaders in the Portland metropolitan. I came from Yemen when I was 19 years, and I coming to the States, yes, we are in a liberal city, but I saw bigotry and hate, divisions, And when we started the Interfaith Council of Greater Portland, the division and the non-acceptance of the LDS Church and the Church of Scientology was very obvious to me. And I mentioned to my dear Catholics and dear, conservative Protestant that, if you don't accept the Mormons and you don't accept the Scientologists, you're not accepting me. We are here all children of God, and we are all here equally partnered, to heal and unify our public square. I have nothing to do with your bigotry and hate, of not accepting the Mormons. Whether the Mormon is a cult or not, that's not my business. Everybody is here equal. I remember, religious freedom to me is what God has told all the prophets, all the prophets, including, the Abrahamic traditions prophets, that God has made it clearly that we are, as prophets, as teachers, that we call into the way to the Lord, وَدَاعِيًا إِلَى اللَّهِ بِإِذْنِهِ وَسِرَاجًا مُنِيرًا. We call into the way of Lord by being in a good example, by being the compass, by being the torch, the light to the way. And how we do that, is by example, is by acceptance. If you look into the history of Islam, I gave two quotations in the chat, one of them by great scholar of law, Dr. El-Hibri from Virginia Commonwealth. She said, the US Constitution and the Medinan Society Constitution, is it a borrowing possibilities or a history of borrowing? These founding fathers and mothers of our great nation didn't work out of a vacuum. They looked into Islamic civilizations in Africa, in Asia, in the recent, history, when, before the Spanish Inquisition, the Spain civilization, the Islamic civilization in Spain, where Jews and Christians and Muslims and other people lived and coexist, with love and respect. And the golden age, 900 of great civilization, when history was misnamed the Dark Ages. It was cities of light in Africa. It was cities of light in Asia. So this is what it means for me. Religious freedom is to accept one another, irrespective of our color of our skin, irrespective of our gender, irrespective of our religiosity. It's all that we are an added value when we are in the public square. What is between you and God, it's between you and God. And this is how Arab Christians survived, with majority Muslims. This is how Hindus survived Islamic civilization in India for 900 years. This is how the advancement in science and anthropology and philosophy and music, at the peak of Islamic civilization. Unfortunately, today bigotry and hate, has been manifested itself with Abel and Cain, and manifested itself in the Holocaust. It's manifested itself with the Palestinian persecution. It manifested itself with the Muslims persecution, with the Crusaders, with the Spanish Inquisition, and so many others. So therefore, acceptance is religious freedom when we accept one another irrespective of our background and irrespect of our belief, irrespect of our ethnicity and colors of our skin.
Thank you, Dr. Saeed. Elder Wright, your thoughts?
I think for every panelist here, our faith or our religion, our belief brings tremendous joy to our souls. And a natural result of that joy is to want to share it with other people. And so freedom of religion, what it means to me is that I can enjoy that basic faith that brings joy to my soul, but I can go and share it with other people with no limits, with the ability to let other people know about what has brought joy to me, and to do it without the limitations of government. So that's how I feel about that.
Thank you. Bishop Smith, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the Catholic perspective when it comes to religious liberty. The Catholic Church published a statement in 2012, and they referred to religious freedom as the first most cherished liberty. And it went on to say that this is not a Catholic issue, this is not a Jewish issue, this is not an Orthodox or Mormon or Muslim issue, it is an American issue. And so I just wondered if you could share with us a little bit more about this perspective and this idea of the first most cherished liberty.
Yeah, from our perspective, if we don't have freedom to practice our faith, then what? Our faith informs who we are, and then how we live and how we act in the world. And so that needs to be protected. So we cannot give what we don't have. And so that particular concern of making sure that people are free to practice their faith unhindered in that sense is very, very important to us. And for us as Catholics, because we have much more, from our own perspective, have a lot of engagement in the world in a whole variety of areas. You should think about our schools, our hospitals, our social justice outreaches, and so on. That impacts us. And so we want to protect that right to be able to worship freely, to be able to express our religious beliefs freely. And that goes back for us. I posted on the chat a document from Vatican II on religious freedom, which begins with the Latin words, but basically the English translation is human dignity. It goes back for us, these things come back to the fundamental dignity of the human person and the ability of the human person to freely practice their faith and to go forward from there. So this is a concern that obviously in the worldwide church we experience, perhaps in ways that some of our churches have experienced as well, when different parts of the world, things aren't as simple or as easy, even though they may be challenging here in the US as elsewhere. But for us, that's key. It's if you don't have the ability to practice your faith and grow in faith and so on, you're not going to be able to go forward from there. Steve was talking about be people of virtue in society, have an impact on the world, bring everything that is good that we have into the public domain.
Thank you. Pastor Hennessee, you had brought up, that you feel that this is a calling. This is something that you have been called to do, the work of God. What are some of the concerns that you are seeing surface in your faith community, maybe especially during the interesting, challenging times we've had during the pandemic? What are some concerns that have surfaced with your particular faith community?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Thank you, Madam Moderator. I appreciate that. I want to get one thing straight. My brother, Alan Euler, sent me a note and told me that my responses were supposed to be 2 minutes. So I've tried to live with that. Now, my brother, Wajdi, doesn't know what 2 minutes means. So I'm going to do my best to answer what you've asked in that particular space, but I'll do what he did. Before you start the clock, I really want to thank Stephen because this was a tremendously inspiring talk today. And not only am I inspired by it, it reminds me of the importance of how we continue to practice our faith and respect the faith of others. In terms of my calling, it's wrapped up, number one, in my culture. The Black race would not still be here if it were not for the fundamental connection from our perspective, from many of our perspectives, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. At the same time, it is important to know how it has literally been the fuel for us to continue in a world that has not treated us as if we are humane on the one, or human on the one hand, and inhumane ways on the other. And as I think about even my 100 years of being on earth and those who came before me, they could not have made it if it were not for the connection they had. Today, I believe that while there may be many who have abandoned the church or religion, if you will, that it's the centering point. Elder Wright said it brings joy. That's exactly right. But in my view, it also brings the ability to have the stamina to handle what comes before us. The awakening that is going on right now, for many of us, we could have an attitude, why did it take 400 years for white people in this country to finally realize that we as Black people have been in the most down position ever? But the fact of the matter is, that may be my flesh, but my spirit says, God is a God who is watching and helping and keeping and blessing. And in the public square, I want to show up personally and privately at all times to be the light, and to not focus on what hasn't been, but focus on what can be. And to love my brothers and sisters, no matter how enlightened or not, to know that we can make a better world together, and to forgive all of the past, which is what you saw play out at Mother Emanuel Church just a few years ago, when each of those family members who had lost family members in a Bible study innocently, who were able to show up in court the next day and say to the assailant, I forgive you. That is the bedrock of who we are, of how our culture and our religious beliefs connect. And we pray to give that same light to the world.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit here. And this is a question for you, Dr. Saeed. You are the only representative on this panel of a non-Christian based faith. And from your perspective, do you feel that your faith beliefs are as readily protected by the Constitution as maybe mainstream Christian beliefs? What's your perspective on your particular protections for your religious beliefs?
Thank you, Anne. Actually, as a matter of fact, Islam embraces all the Hebrew prophets, the children of Israel prophets. So we embrace Judaism and Christianity, and so I'm represented by all here today. So, as you know, that Islam accepts, Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, and his mother, and we accept Moses and all the prophets that came before Prophet Muhammad, that all prophets of God. So therefore, I feel that I am, the peacemaker here, among the Christian groups and the different denominations. So the challenge is today, to be honest with you, is how can we really exemplify, the respect and the acceptance and the love. Each one of us preach from our pulpits, whether that's the pulpit, I'm speaking here from the Abrahamic traditions, whether that's, the Jewish during the Sabbath, or the Christian during the Sunday services, or the Seventh-day Adventists on the Sabbath on Saturday, or the LDS. How can we exemplify this love and this acceptance, today? You know, we can easily point fingers left and right, we are in a society that, built, by law, built by constitution. Yes, we had a history of genocide of the indigenous people. Yes, we have a history of slavery. Yes, we have the history of violations, of Chinese American, Japanese American, Latinos. And today, the celebrity is Islam and Muslims, with the rise of Islamophobia. So I think it's very important, as Professor Collis said, may God bless him, for his wonderful presentation, that we need to stand for each other, irrespect, who is in the other side. Understanding the other is part of me. In our tradition, that's, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has said, if one part of the body feels the pains, the rest of the body should feel it, and should cure it, So I personally tend, to think in a positive way, also to be a practical person. I understand the challenges, but we are governed, by law. The law is, at the end of the day, protects everybody. And I would really appreciate, for those of us that are lawyers and religious scholars, you need to read Dr. El-Hibri, the Medinan Society and the US Institution, borrowing possibilities or history of borrowing, that we don't work from vacuum. We are complementing each other. Civilizations have learned from each other, to create what we call the beloved community, the beloved sisters and brothers. So I strongly believe that, our, constitution does protect, one another. It's the human nature that interpreted sometimes in a different way, but humans, as we say in Arabic, insan, sometimes we tend to forget. We forgot, sometimes our behaviors, our values, our ethos, especially in the last, 4 years of 2016, 2020, but we are back on track, and that's the beauty of our nation, that, democracy, religious freedom allows us, to come back to our common sense. So in answering your question, my dear Anne, the US Constitution does protect me and protect everybody.
Dr. Metzger, I wanted to expand a little bit on the idea that you shared of the importance of religious freedom for all. And I know in our communications prior to preparing for this conference, you had expressed that importance to you of the freedom of belief for all. Some have expressed concern that religious liberty is kind of a code word for religious bigotry. For example, it could be used to discriminate against the LGBTQ and others who espouse a different moral view than the religious right. How can the message of religious freedom be one of love and respect for all beliefs among the differences?
Thank you very much. Yes, it can be code for bigotry. It doesn't need to be, it shouldn't be, but it can be. And it at times is. So just to put that out there, we live in a pluralistic society, and so we have to navigate this well. It's not a theocracy, it's a pluralistic society. And so while in our respective traditions, in our respective religious communities, we can certainly hold firmly to our theological and moral convictions. Nonetheless, in a pluralistic society, we need to make sure that we're navigating the public square in a manner that really is seeking to affirm the rights of all people. And that gets really complex, to say the least. How we navigate that, it is not easy, and in light of everything that's already been said today. But I think that has to be the position, that has to be the posture in terms of how we proceed. I'd like to just take it up from one particular angle, again, thinking through my own particular faith tradition, evangelical Protestantism. I did my doctoral work on Karl Barth, who was a Swiss theologian. And Barth did say in some of his own political writings that a church that demands rights in the sphere of the state, demands rights for itself in the sphere of the state, is a spiritually unfree church. And so I think, while I certainly support religious liberties, I think the demand aspect for whatever it might be that we're demanding has to account for the freedom of the gospel. And the Apostle Paul said, while I'm in chains, he wrote many of his letters from prison, he said, nonetheless, the gospel is not chained. And that's something I think through as I engage my own particular evangelical Christian community, and I think of Christian nationalism that's so prominent today. I think that these are matters that play in and engage the question that you're even asking me in terms of our larger posture and public engagement. So I can add more, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Steve, do you have anything to add on this topic?
Yeah, when we think about the question of balancing religious freedom claims with LGBT plus rights, I think too many people come at it from the wrong starting points. So people who are very much concerned about LGBT plus rights and equality, I am among them. They come at it only from trying to see how they can ensure that they get the outcomes that they're interested in. Folks on the other side come at it only from the standpoint of trying to see, well, how can they protect religious freedoms of people? So for example, if you have a florist who simply cannot engage in her profession, if it means she has to make custom wedding arrangements for same-sex weddings, so she'll just be out of a job, they're trying to prevent that from happening. I think the better way to come at this is to recognize that there are two historic wrongs here we're trying to prevent. One is the historic wrong of people not being able to participate fully in places like public accommodations and in society. That's the LGBT rights concern. The other concern is another historically odious wrong of denying people the ability to be in their professions simply because of their religious beliefs. That has a long and dark history. You can go back and look at the English Test Acts, where Catholics were not allowed to be lawyers or teachers or professors. They couldn't be in any job that required more than 2 apprentices. So we're trying, the question is, how can we come up with a solution that can address both of these concerns at the same time? And I loved what Dr. Metzger said earlier about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Too many people are trying to achieve one, and the end result ends up being throwing the other side out. So we have this divide across the country where both sides are kind of at loggerheads because they won't seek for a solution that can prevent both of those historic wrongs. But the reality is there are solutions out there. There are legal solutions out there. I would encourage people to look up something called the Fairness for All Act, which has been proposed as a means of balancing the interests on both sides here. It does require a loving attitude from both sides to be able to live in a society where we say we're going to live and let live a little bit, even if we know there are people out there who disagree with us. But it's possible to protect both interests here. It's just going to require some open-mindedness. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. There was a question that came in, and maybe this is another question for you, Steve, but is there a way to preserve cultural practices that have religious undertones and still be considered non-discriminatory? For example, some have expressed concern that in the name of separation of church and state, we've been asked to remove kind of all references to God from the public discourse, schools, celebrations, holidays. Is there a way to preserve these cultural traditions without promoting or endorsing a particular faith belief?
So this gets really, really complicated, and it gets into that section. When I talked about my building of religious freedom, there was the one pillar that talked about the establishment clause. This gets into that, and it's a year's worth of material that we could explore. So it's not like a very simple, easy answer. The problem you have is, let me just give an example out of Quebec. There's not in our country, but they have the same issues. And I actually saw someone in the Q&A bring this up. Quebec passed a law that said no public employee can wear religious garb. You can't wear a cross. If you're Muslim, you couldn't wear a hijab. If you're a teacher and you wanted to, as a Sikh, and you had to wear a turban, you couldn't do it. all sorts of things that have now been prevented in Quebec. That to me seems extreme. What you're doing is you're burdening the free exercise of anybody that would want to work in the public sphere in the name of trying to prevent the impression that government is endorsing or coercing religion on people, right? That's going way too far. In the United States, what we say is government act, actually what we say is a jumbled mess. So Supreme Court has been less than clear on this question. But one of the things we often say is that government actors can't coerce religion onto other people. So what that would mean is a teacher, let's just use a teacher, for example. A teacher could wear a cross around her neck. She could pray at her desk. She could even have her own scripture study. What she couldn't do, though, is say, force all of the students in her classroom to engage in scripture study with her, right? Or she couldn't force all the other students to wear a cross or hand out crosses in the classroom. That's where we try to draw the line. And there are cases that get into this gray zone where it's not necessarily easy to know exactly where we should go. And to be honest with you, there has not been what I would say a satisfactory legal solution to this problem yet. I think we would all agree, for example, that a school district couldn't punish a Latter-day Saint for refusing to engage in a Baptist prayer, which is actually a real case that went up to the Supreme Court in the 1990s. I think we'd all agree you can't do that. But what about singing a song in the choir that has a Christian theme to it? And, how do you deal with that? How are the Jewish students going to feel? Or perhaps people who don't believe in Jesus Christ? Those are the things we're still trying to completely finalize. And scholars and judges go back and forth between whether or not the rule is government can't coerce religion versus government can't endorse religion versus another confusing test that nobody likes to talk about. We haven't resolved exactly where that line should be and how we define coercion versus endorsement. And those are those gray areas that we're still trying to figure out. But I will say this, I'm thankful that we haven't gone as far as Quebec did in basically preventing people from being able to wear any religious garb whatsoever if they're serving in government positions. I think that's an excessive way to deal with it. I hope that answered the question, Anne. I don't know if it did or not, but.
Yeah, thank you. I know these are complex issues. And so, these answers are also complex. It's not something that can be solved easily or quickly, for sure. I wanted to open it up to all of the panel. What are some things that you would like to see your congregations do to help support religious freedom? What are concrete ways that people, in our audience here today can step forward and become more involved or support religious freedom activities? And maybe there's some specific things in your own faith communities or just in general, if any of you have any thoughts about that. I know, Steve, in your address, you talked about getting involved locally. Are there some things right now that locally people can get involved in their local communities to promote religious freedom?
And I saw somebody put in the Q&A that they asked, what are the warning signs? Not always, but more often than not, religious freedom gets burdened when local actors simply aren't being sensitive to the needs of a religious minority in a community. It doesn't have to be necessarily a minority, but a religious group in the community. So if you see, for example, a student who's being punished because she can't engage in the choir practices on Sunday, which is a real case occurring in Michigan, you can stand by that student. Sunday's her Sabbath day and she didn't feel like she could do it and the teacher was punishing her. When that gets on your radar, you can stand up for that student in a respectful way. When you see a town passing some type of zoning ordinance or something that prevents a church from engaging in their religious exercise, whether it's your church or not, you can go and speak to the town council about the importance of religious exercise and finding a way to allow the church to do this. It requires a lot of work. The reality is, living in an environment in which the people govern themselves requires the people to do a lot of work. we can't just sit back and enjoy the freedoms we have. We actually have to go out there and be involved so that we can see when someone's religious freedom is being burdened and then step in to help. I know that takes a lot of people out of their comfort zones, but it is the requirement of constitutional government, quite frankly.
In my perspective, I think how we can reclaim and keep the beloved community alive, in our public square, and nothing better than putting our faith into action, by sharing the resources, the resources, the professional resources, the expertise, the financial resources. We are a nation that is extremely generous. Americans has given over $300 billion, according to the Chronicle of Philanthropy in 2017. But this, giving, has to be given in a smart way, how we can integrate by design the resources that God has blessed us with, Today, there are so many religious groups and so many ethnic groups are well-to-do financially and professionally, and how they can integrate these services, without any strings attached to it. So this is where I think we can reclaim the nuns, as Stephen has says, or Professor Collis has says, the nuns, the N-O-N-E. And people doubt faith today. They doubt, they doubt religion, not faith, And I think it's very important that we show, this beloved, community, how we can embrace one another by sharing, the intellect and the professional and the financial resources to be able to move forward. During the pandemic, one of our greatest writers here in Portland, at the Oregonian, his name is Steve Duane. He wrote, a column, that myself and my beloved brother, Alan Euler, in the New Portland Foundation have talked about, the Rockwood, neighborhood, that, they have been abandoned, they have been left behind, when all these billions of dollars that have been given to our society, these groups, of low-income families, African-American, Latinos, immigrant and refugees has been abandoned and left behind, and nobody from the government has integrated the resources to reach out, and neither the churches and neither the, the other religious groups. So sharing resources is a key factor in reclaiming and healing and unifying our public square.
And with your permission, can I add to the discussion on this question? Just three quick things come to mind. The first one is raise people's consciousness of this issue. We live in Steve, we live in a very, very secular state here in Oregon. It's usually one of the top 2 or 3 most unchurched states in the nation. And the issue of religious liberty for folks is, it's not so much that people are oppressing us, it's that just people are unaware. And we, for all of us here, it's a case of we need to raise people's consciousness of this, and in a conversational way, not in a imposing our view on people, but exposing them to the issue that we face with religious liberty. The second thing is work together and on particular issues, because irrespective of our differences in belief, there are fundamental issues that will join all of us together, like this conference, for instance. We're talking about this, but there are other issues where our own particular faith and practice and belief will be very similar, and we can work together in those areas, and that builds relationship with one another. Another thing I'd say is build those relationships. And often we think this thing is a very sort of complex thing. It's as simple as, hey, can we get together? Let's go get a coffee. Let's go for a walk. Let's chat about this. How are you doing? Something like that, where you build relationships on a grassroots level. It takes away the, well, he or she is that, and we're this. It's like, we're human beings. We each are seeking God. We're seeking to live our lives of faith. It builds that relationship. And when that's there, we're far less likely to categorize people and write them off. We may say, that I have a different belief or understanding regarding that, but help me understand where you're coming from. That builds fraternity amongst ourselves. And that's what Pope Francis is just emphasizing in his recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And then beyond all that is we just have to be a witness in the culture. When people see us witnessing, from a Christian perspective or a Catholic perspective, the church grew in the Roman Empire, not because of the doctrinal arguments, not because of those primarily, but because the witness of the faith of believers. And people said, this is real. These people are willing to do this. And for all of us, people of faith, living in a secular society, that witness of people living lives of faith, not only in their places of worship, but going out into the real world, that gives a credibility to our words beyond any top argument we could give. Thank you.
Thank you. I know, Dr. Metzger, I believe you have something to say, and then Pastor Hennessee after. Please share.
All right, thank you. Following up on the last point by the bishop, that relational connections are so important. We need to move forward with a spirit of really being intrigued with the religious other, not to be about inquisition, but inquisitional as far as our posture. And I think that includes reading people's traditions works. It involves doing potlucks together. We've worked at New Wine, New Wineskins, an institute I direct. We have been engaged with the Zen Buddhist community for about 15 years or more, with going through our religious and spiritual convictions over potlucks, where everyone brings a dish to share. And then we also go through that potluck on equal playing field, so to speak. The trauma, the challenges, the fears we may have, the anxieties. And when we build those relationships, as was just shared, then we start taking on board one another's concerns more. It becomes less academic and more grassroots. And then we really do partner with one another more because we are friends with one another. And that is difficult, it's challenging. There's a lot of trauma, a lot of fear that we have to work through depending on where we're coming from, but it's worth it in the long run to have those friends, to move beyond, again, inquisition to an inquisitional spirit and orientation.
Thank you. Pastor Hennessee?
Yes, thank you, Madam Moderator. And again, mine would be another paragraph in the same book that got started by Wajdi to Bishop to Dr. Metzger, and that is that we must be intentional. I'm grateful to be a part of this session today. I think it's extremely inspiring, but I think we need to figure out how we do this again and how we work together again. In our work here in the Portland area, we reach out intentionally to other members of other groups at all times. When the synagogue in Pittsburgh was bombed, we showed up at Congregation Beth Israel, a number of us did, to be there to support our Jewish brothers and sisters. MET, the Muslim Educational Trust, is extremely involved in bringing people together. Our church does the same thing. We were blessed that Alan Euler, because I serve on the Ecumenical Ministry of Oregon board, as we gathered the common table, and Alan and I got the opportunity to get to know one another. And we have now 2 years in a row done a Christmas concert together. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and our church and a Tiger Tongan United Methodist Church. In the middle of the summer, obviously with COVID last year, we couldn't do it, but 9 congregations got together to have service in the park, Dawson Park, here in Portland, of all different denominations and then eat together, as Dr. Metzger has mentioned. It's interesting how food brings us together no matter who we are. But it's really about developing a relationship. It's really about being willing to be, to some degree, stretch, and to some degree be uncomfortable, but learn and grow, build relationships together. My final thought, I would say, because there's so many ways that we do this, we've preached in each other's service. I still laugh when Brother Allen says that when he came into our church, he was ushered all the way up to the pulpit to sit with us because we wanted him to know that he was welcome and to speak into our service. And I was allowed to do the same thing in theirs. And I would just challenge us, let us be in this theme, the open in our thoughts, loving in our interactions, and wise in our discernment. We have the opportunity to be the light that God wants us to be. And I pray that we will embrace it. Thank you for the chance to be here today.
Thank you. Elder Wright, do you have anything to add?
I do. I am so grateful for these wonderful, inspired, and wise leaders in the council that they shared on this original question. I guess I think that a secular society will be more likely to embrace religion when they see us helping with societal problems. And I couldn't help but think of September 8th of this year here in Southern Oregon. I live down in close to Medford, when a fire burned over 1,600 homes in Jackson County. And what I saw happen after that, because of these bonds that had already been talked about, these relationships that had already existed, people of faith and people that don't have any faith worked together to solve some societal problems in the few days and then weeks after, where we joined together and in a wonderful way helped many people that were struggling in their just finding a place to live or food to eat. Those are all things that we have in common with each other. And I know that in this community, after those few weeks passed and they saw the power of religion to help a society in the challenge that we faced in those few weeks, people came away with a much more positive feeling about, wow, these people of faith, we need them in our communities. We may not agree with their beliefs, but they do great things in our communities. And I see the same thing as we look at the problem of homelessness. We have joined together with Roman Catholics. We have joined together with evangelicals to create a better situation for homeless people in this valley. And so those bonds, these relationships that have been so wisely mentioned, are essential to be able to work together to show society that we are a huge blessing in society. They will come to see more and more that they need people of faith because we are a valued community partner. They see us as somebody that are as people who are solving problems.
Thank you. We are coming up on our time limit here. I know there are lots of questions in the chat that unfortunately we haven't been able to get to. I do want to remind everyone that we're hoping that this is just a beginning conversation and that we can move forward in the future and have more events like this to join together and learn from each other and support one another in this important issue. We've put on the screen a few resources where you can turn to. I know that there is a Facebook group that has been established. Many of you may be part of that group where things have been shared and resources. I know I saw Wajdi was inserting some resources that he knows of into the chat. So we hope that this can be just kind of a springboard and that we can use this to strengthen one another and continue our commitment in this. I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us today, for sharing for helping us gain a greater understanding of these issues. Appreciate you taking your time to be here with us today. And with that, I will turn the time back over to Elder Wright.
I am feeling a little bit emotional right now. I'm so grateful to everyone who has participated. Every one of these panelists are just a blessing in the community that they live in. Thank you so much for your inspired comments and your wise observations. And thank you so much for the way you've moderated this event. You've been wonderful. As I've listened to so many of you, these wonderful panelists express this idea, I'm just gonna maybe put it into a brief phrase, this idea of speaking out for what we believe and how being vigorous in wanting our religious beliefs. And I've heard it referred to as a two-sided coin. Whenever you pick up a coin, you have to pick up both sides. And so on the one side is this need to let other people know how we feel about our faith and to do it respectfully and with love, but to be vigorous about it. But then on the other side of that coin is the need to be respectful and deeply seek to love those who disagree with us and recognize that my right to seek my freedom of religion is also the same right of the other person on the other side of the coin who may have their own personal beliefs too about whatever they feel strongly about. So thank you so much today for everyone who has participated. We will be doing this again. And with that, I'll turn the time over now to Elder Tawana E. Hennessee, who will offer our closing prayer, and then we'll be done. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this amazing talk. I'm ending this meeting or this webinar here, just feeling very hopeful about the future and where we're going. And just to see everyone here is just awesome and a testament to God. So I'm gonna go ahead and begin our closing prayer, and I'd ask you all to join in with me. Thank you. Oh God, we thank you for this amazing time today, hearing, learning, and being reminded about just how great you are and how amazingly you do your work and your work through us. You've brought us here together from all walks of life and remind us that despite our religious backgrounds, we are all your sons and your daughters. We are challenged to live in a world that seems less tolerant, less loving, less hopeful, and less united. However, we are grateful that we have been chosen despite the world's trends. We believe in you and who you are and how you use us in light in the midst of darkness. Let us love each other as you have guided us. Let us be more hopeful and helpful in all that we do, knowing that we represent you in our walk each and every day. This has been a great opportunity to hear a fabulous keynote speaker, each of the panelists, the sponsors, and questions from this great audience. This has been a tremendously inspiring mountaintop experience, and for that we are grateful. Let us breathe in and let us breathe out how grateful we are for this time and prepare to leave this mountain and to go back into the valley, being more hopeful, being more loving, being more understanding, and being more determined to be a good example of what you expect of us as we navigate these difficult waters. With your help, we will be successful. In your wonderful and matchless name, we pray. Amen.